The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground as Colonel Marcus Steele Rodriguez watched through his binoculars. What he saw made his 25 years of combat experience seem meaningless. A young woman, barely out of her teens, was systematically hitting targets at distances that would challenge his best snipers. Each shot was perfect. Each movement calculated. Each breath controlled with the precision of a master marksman. But it wasn't just her skill that stunned him. It was her complete calm. While seasoned soldiers struggled with the recoil and heat of their weapons, she handled her M24 sniper rifle like it was an extension of her own body. No trembling hands. No hesitation. No fear. When the exercise ended and she began cleaning her weapon with the same methodical precision she'd used to fire it, Colonel Rodriguez knew he had to ask the question that was burning in his mind. He approached her, his boots crunching on the gravel, and watched as she disassembled the rifle without even looking at the parts. "Where did you learn to handle that rifle?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded thousands of soldiers. The woman looked up, her green eyes meeting his with a steadiness that seemed impossible for someone so young. What she told him next would change everything he thought he knew about war, survival, and the price of protecting the innocent. This is the true story of Sarah Chen, a woman whose deadly skills were forged not in military academies or elite training camps, but in the most unlikely place imaginable. A story that begins with a father's desperate decision and ends with a daughter becoming one of the most lethal protectors the world has ever known. Sarah Chen's story began 16 years before that fateful meeting with Colonel Rodriguez, in the remote mountains of Northern California. Her father, David Chen, was a former Army Ranger who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before returning home to build a quiet life as a wilderness guide. He had chosen this isolated location specifically to escape the memories of war, but fate had other plans. The Chen family lived in a modest cabin surrounded by dense forest, miles away from the nearest neighbor. David had built their home with his own hands, creating a self-sufficient sanctuary where he hoped to raise his daughter away from the violence he had seen overseas. Sarah's mother, Maria, was a nurse who had met David during his recovery from a combat injury. Together, they represented everything peaceful about civilian life. But peace was shattered on a cold October morning when Sarah was just 7 years old. Maria had driven into town for supplies, leaving David and Sarah alone at the cabin. What should have been a routine shopping trip became a nightmare when Maria's car was found abandoned on a mountain road, her purse missing and blood on the driver's seat. The local sheriff's investigation revealed a disturbing truth. A group of escaped convicts had been hiding in the mountains for weeks, surviving by robbing travelers and, worse. The evidence suggested Maria had been taken, but, despite extensive searches, no trace of her could be found. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, with no sign of Maria or her captors. David's military training kicked in as he realized the horrible reality of their situation. The men who had taken his wife were still out there, still dangerous, and his daughter was now a potential target. The local law enforcement was overwhelmed and understaffed. The nearest police station was 2 hours away. If these predators came for Sarah, David would be her only protection. That night, as 7-year-old Sarah slept fitfully in her bed, David made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He retrieved his military gear from storage and began planning not just to defend his home, but to train his daughter to defend herself. He knew it seemed extreme, perhaps even wrong, to expose a child to such training. But the alternative, losing Sarah the way he had lost Maria, was unthinkable. David started Sarah's training gradually, disguising it as games and adventures. They would go on treasure hunts through the forest, where Sarah learned to move silently and observe her surroundings. They played hide-and-seek games that taught her camouflage and patience. David taught her to read tracks, identify sounds, and understand the patterns of nature that would alert her to human presence. As months passed, the training became more sophisticated. David introduced Sarah to firearms, starting with a small .22 rifle that was perfectly sized for her small frame. He taught her the fundamental rules of gun safety, making her recite them until they became automatic responses. Sarah learned that weapons were never toys, never pointed at anything she didn't intend to destroy, and never fired without complete awareness of what lay beyond her target. The first time Sarah fired a rifle, she was 8 years old. David had set up a target range behind their cabin, using old cans and bottles as targets. He showed her how to hold the rifle, how to breathe, how to align the sights. When Sarah squeezed the trigger for the first time, the recoil knocked her backward, but she immediately asked to try again.
Sarah proved to be a natural marksman.
Her small size, which might have been a disadvantage in other pursuits, actually helped her shooting. She had less body mass to create movement that would disturb her aim, and her naturally calm demeanor served her well in the patient art of precision shooting. David recognized her talent immediately, but he also saw something deeper. Sarah approached shooting with the same quiet intensity she brought to everything else. She didn't just want to hit targets, she wanted to understand why bullets flew the way they did, how wind and distance affected accuracy, and what made the difference between a good shot and a perfect shot. By the time Sarah was 10, she could hit targets consistently at ranges that impressed even her father. David had upgraded her equipment several times, eventually settling on a modified AR-15 that had been adjusted for her size. Sarah treated the rifle with reverence, cleaning and maintaining it with the same care other children might give to a beloved pet. She understood that this weapon might someday be the only thing standing between her and the kind of evil that had taken her mother. David's training wasn't limited to marksmanship. He taught Sarah hand-to-hand combat, adapting military techniques for her small frame. She learned how to use an attacker's size and momentum against them, how to strike at vulnerable points that could disable much larger opponents, and how to escape from various types of holds and restraints. More importantly, David taught her how to think tactically, to assess threats quickly, and to make life-or-death decisions without hesitation. The training intensified when Sarah turned 12. David had learned through his contacts in law enforcement that the men responsible for Maria's disappearance were still believed to be active in the region. There had been other incidents, other families affected by their violence. The authorities were doing their best, but the vast wilderness provided too many places to hide, and the criminals seemed to know the mountains as well as David did. Sarah never questioned her father's decision to train her so extensively. She had grown up hearing bedtime stories about her mother, understanding that Maria had been taken by bad people who might come for them next. In Sarah's mind, learning to shoot and fight wasn't unusual, it was necessary survival. She approached her training with the same dedication other children might bring to piano lessons or soccer practice. When Sarah was 13, her skills were put to the test for the first time. David was away for 3 days, guiding a group of hikers through a particularly challenging section of wilderness. Sarah was alone at the cabin, something that had become routine as she grew older and more capable. She knew the security protocols by heart: keep the doors locked, monitor the perimeter cameras David had installed, maintain radio contact with him twice daily, and never hesitate to shoot if threatened. On the second night of David's absence, the motion sensors around the cabin detected movement. Sarah watched the monitors from the secure room David had built in the cabin's basement. 2 men were approaching through the forest, moving with the careful stealth of people who didn't want to be detected. They were armed, carrying what appeared to be stolen hunting rifles, and they were heading directly for the cabin. Sarah's training took over. She retrieved her rifle, checked her ammunition, and moved to the shooting position David had prepared on the second floor. The position offered excellent fields of fire while keeping her concealed from anyone approaching the cabin. She activated the emergency beacon that would alert David to the danger, but she knew he was too far away to help immediately. The men reached the cabin's clearing and began circling the structure, testing doors and windows. Sarah could hear them talking in low voices, discussing how to get inside and what they expected to find. One of them mentioned that they had been watching the cabin for days, waiting for the army guy to leave. They knew about David, but they clearly didn't know about Sarah. When one of the intruders started forcing the front door, Sarah made her decision. David had taught her that warning shots were dangerous. They revealed your position without eliminating the threat. If she was going to shoot, it had to count. Sarah took careful aim at the man breaking down the door and fired a single shot. The .308 round from her rifle struck the intruder's center mass, dropping him instantly. The second man dove for cover, shouting in panic and trying to locate where the shot had come from. Sarah had already moved to a different position, just as David had trained her to do. When the second intruder tried to retreat into the forest, she put another round into the ground directly in front of him. "Stop running or the next one goes through you," Sarah called out, her voice carrying the calm authority David had drilled into her during countless training sessions. The man froze, dropping his weapon and raising his hands. Sarah kept her rifle trained on him while using her radio to contact law enforcement. When the sheriff's deputies arrived 3 hours later, they found a 13-year-old girl calmly holding an armed criminal at gunpoint while his dead partner lay motionless near the cabin's front door. The investigation that followed revealed that the 2 men were part of the same group that had been terrorizing the mountain communities for years. The dead man carried identification documents that had belonged to several missing hikers, including items that had belonged to Maria Chen. For David and Sarah, it was a form of closure, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in Sarah's development.
Word of Sarah's actions spread through the law enforcement community.
A 13-year-old who could handle armed intruders with such composure was almost unheard of. FBI agents interviewed Sarah extensively, partly to understand how such a young person had managed to remain so calm under deadly pressure, and partly to learn from her training methods.
David found himself in an unusual position.
Law enforcement agencies began consulting with him about training techniques, particularly for situations involving civilian defense in remote areas. Sarah's story became a case study in how proper preparation and training could enable even young people to protect themselves and others when necessary. But the attention also brought scrutiny.
Child Protective Services questioned whether David's training methods were appropriate for a minor.
Psychologists evaluated Sarah to determine if her experiences had caused trauma or psychological damage. What they found surprised everyone involved in the case. Sarah showed no signs of post-traumatic stress from the shooting incident. Her psychological evaluations indicated a remarkably stable and mature young person who understood the difference between right and wrong, who felt no pleasure in violence, but who was prepared to use force to protect herself and others when necessary. The shooting hadn't changed her fundamental nature, it had simply confirmed that her training worked.
The media attention surrounding Sarah's story was intense but brief.
David and Sarah gave a few carefully controlled interviews, mainly to discourage other criminals who might be considering the Chen cabin as a target.
Sarah's calm demeanor and articulate explanations of her actions impressed reporters and viewers alike.
She didn't boast about her skills or seem to enjoy the attention.
Instead, she spoke matter-of-factly about doing what was necessary to survive. Following the incident, David expanded Sarah's training even further.
He brought in experts from various fields, a former Navy SEAL who taught advanced marksmanship, a retired FBI hostage negotiator who explained psychological aspects of threat assessment, and a military physician who trained Sarah in battlefield medicine.
Sarah absorbed these lessons with the same quiet intensity she had always shown.
By the time Sarah turned 15, her reputation in certain circles was already established. Law enforcement agencies in 3 states knew about the young woman who could outshoot most of their officers. Military recruiters began visiting the Chen cabin, hoping to convince Sarah to consider a career in the armed forces when she came of age. But Sarah remained focused on her immediate responsibilities. She helped her father with his wilderness guide business, using her tracking and observation skills to help clients navigate the mountains safely. She completed her high school education through correspondence courses, maintaining excellent grades while continuing her tactical training. To most outside observers, Sarah appeared to be a normal teenager who happened to live in unusual circumstances. The truth was more complex. Sarah had grown up in a world where violence was always a possibility, where constant vigilance was necessary for survival, and where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. This environment had shaped her into someone who was extraordinarily capable but also profoundly serious about life. She understood consequences in a way most teenagers never would. David watched his daughter's development with mixed emotions. He was proud of her skills and her character, but he also worried about what he had created. Sarah was becoming someone who could protect herself and others, but she was also becoming someone for whom normal teenage concerns seemed trivial and unimportant. She had few friends her own age, partly because of their remote location, but also because she found it difficult to relate to people who had never faced real danger. When Sarah turned 16, David made another life-changing decision. He contacted his former commanding officer, Colonel Marcus Rodriguez, who was now running an elite training program for military special operations. David explained Sarah's background and abilities, asking for Rodriguez's honest assessment of whether Sarah might have a future in military service.
Colonel Rodriguez was skeptical at first.
He had heard stories about the mountain girl who could shoot better than trained soldiers, but he assumed the stories were exaggerated. When David invited him to visit the cabin and observe Sarah's abilities firsthand, Rodriguez decided to make the trip more out of curiosity than genuine interest. What he witnessed during that visit changed his perspective entirely. Sarah demonstrated marksmanship skills that surpassed most of his elite troops. She showed tactical awareness that impressed him, and she displayed a level of emotional control under pressure that he had rarely seen in soldiers with years of combat experience.
But, most importantly, Sarah showed a deep understanding of the moral weight of violence.
She didn't see shooting as a sport or an adventure, she understood it as a tool to be used only when necessary to protect innocent life.
Colonel Rodriguez left the mountain with an unprecedented offer.
Sarah could join his program immediately, despite being several years younger than the usual recruits. She would receive the finest military training available, working alongside the most elite soldiers in the country. It was an opportunity that thousands of young people would have considered the chance of a lifetime.
Sarah's response surprised both her father and the colonel.
She asked for time to think about the offer, not because she was uncertain about her abilities, but because she wanted to understand what kind of person such training would make her become. She had seen what military service had done to her father, both the positive and negative aspects, and she wanted to be certain that this path was right for her. The decision would ultimately be made for her by events beyond her control, events that would test every skill she had learned and force her to discover exactly what kind of person she had become. The answer to Colonel Rodriguez's offer came sooner than anyone expected, delivered in the form of a crisis that would test every aspect of Sarah's training.
It began on a seemingly ordinary Thursday in late spring when Sarah was 17.
She had spent the morning helping her father prepare for a week-long expedition with a group of corporate executives who wanted to experience real wilderness adventure. David was increasingly selective about his clients, preferring people who respected the mountains rather than those seeking cheap thrills. Sarah was cleaning her rifle on the cabin's front porch when she noticed something unusual in the distance. Through the scope of her spotting scope, she could see smoke rising from the direction of Pine Ridge Elementary School, located in the small town 15 miles down the mountain. The smoke was too thick and too dark to be from a controlled burn or normal fire.
Something was seriously wrong. David emerged from the cabin as Sarah was adjusting the scope for a better view.
When she described what she was seeing, he immediately retrieved his own binoculars and confirmed her observation. The smoke was definitely coming from the school area, and it appeared to be getting worse. David tried to contact the local sheriff's office on his radio, but received no response. The radio chatter he could intercept was confused and chaotic, with multiple units calling for backup and medical assistance. Within minutes, they learned the terrible truth from an emergency broadcast.
Armed men had taken hostages at Pine Ridge Elementary School.
The initial reports were fragmentary and contradictory, but the basic facts were clear. Multiple gunmen had entered the school during morning classes, shots had been fired, and an unknown number of children and staff members were being held inside the building. Sarah felt a cold clarity settle over her as she listened to the reports. This was the scenario her father had prepared her for all her life, not the specific situation, but the moment when innocent people needed protection and she had the skills to provide it. She began mentally cataloging her equipment and calculating distances and firing angles. David was thinking along the same lines, but he was also considering the legal and practical implications of what they might be contemplating. Taking action against armed criminals threatening their own property was one thing. Inserting themselves into an active hostage situation involving children was something entirely different. The authorities would undoubtedly try to handle the situation through negotiation and specialized tactical teams. But, as the radio reports continued, it became clear that the local authorities were overwhelmed.
Pine Ridge was a small town with a minimal police force.
The nearest SWAT team was more than 2 hours away, and the FBI's hostage rescue team would take even longer to arrive. Meanwhile, children were trapped with armed men who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence. Sarah made the decision for both of them. "We have to help," she said simply, already moving toward her equipment locker. "Those children don't have 2 hours." David understood that his daughter was right, but he also understood the enormous risks they would be taking. If they intervened and something went wrong, they could make the situation worse. If they succeeded, they would likely face serious legal consequences for taking the law into their own hands. But if they did nothing and children died when they might have prevented it, they would have to live with that knowledge for the rest of their lives. They moved with the efficiency of a trained military unit. Sarah assembled her gear, her primary rifle, a backup pistol, ammunition, first aid supplies, and communication equipment. David gathered his own weapons and tactical equipment, including smoke grenades and flashbangs from his military surplus collection. They loaded everything into David's modified pickup truck and began the treacherous drive down the mountain road toward Pine Ridge. During the drive, they monitored radio transmissions to gather intelligence about the situation. The reports painted a grim picture. At least 3 armed men had entered the school through the main entrance, overwhelming the single security guard and taking control of the building. They had herded students and teachers into the main gymnasium, where they were being held under armed guard. The gunman's demands were unclear, but they had already fired shots during the initial takeover, and at least one person was confirmed wounded. The local police had established a perimeter around the school but were afraid to approach closer for fear of provoking the gunman into harming the hostages. The sheriff was trying to establish communication with the hostage-takers, but they weren't responding to attempts at contact. The situation was deteriorating by the minute. As they approached Pine Ridge, Sarah and David could see the chaos surrounding the school. Police cars, ambulances, and fire trucks filled the nearby streets. News vans were already arriving, drawn by the sensational nature of the story. Hundreds of parents were being held back by police barriers, desperately trying to learn whether their children were safe. David parked their truck nearly a mile from the school and began studying the building through binoculars. Pine Ridge Elementary was a typical small-town school, a single-story brick building with large windows and multiple entrances. The building was surrounded by open ground that would make any approach difficult, but Sarah had already identified several possibilities. Sarah set up her rifle on a low ridge that overlooked the school from the north. The position gave her clear lines of sight to most of the building's windows and entrances, while keeping her concealed from the school and the police perimeter. She could see movement inside the building, but couldn't yet identify specific targets. David used his radio to contact the police command post, identifying himself as former military with specialized training and offering assistance. The response was predictably negative. The incident commander appreciated the offer but couldn't authorize civilian involvement in such a dangerous situation. David didn't argue, but he also didn't withdraw. Instead, he and Sarah continued to gather intelligence and plan their own response. The breakthrough came when Sarah spotted movement in one of the school's upper windows. Using her rifle scope at maximum magnification, she could see into what appeared to be the school's main office. One of the gunmen was clearly visible, moving back and forth while apparently talking on the telephone. Sarah estimated the range at approximately 350 yards, well within her capabilities under normal conditions. But these weren't normal conditions. The man was moving, the angle was challenging, and, most critically, she couldn't be absolutely certain that her target was actually one of the hostage-takers rather than a police officer or school administrator. Sarah had been taught never to take a shot unless she was completely certain of her target, and this situation was too complex for hasty decisions. The decision was made for her when the situation inside the school suddenly escalated. Sarah watched through her scope as the man in the office window raised what appeared to be an assault rifle and pointed it toward the floor below, apparently threatening someone outside Sarah's field of vision. At the same moment, she heard gunshots from inside the building, followed immediately by screaming. Sarah's training took over. She settled into her shooting position, controlled her breathing, and aligned her crosshairs on the gunman's center mass. The wind was minimal, the range was well within her comfort zone, and her target was momentarily stationary. She squeezed the trigger with the smooth pressure her father had taught her years earlier. The .308 round traveled the 350 yards to its target in less than half a second. Through her scope, Sarah saw the gunman spin and fall backward, his weapon flying from his hands. She had aimed for center mass, but the bullet had struck him high in the chest, angled upward by the challenging shot geometry. The result was immediately fatal. The effect of Sarah's shot was immediate and chaotic. The remaining gunmen inside the school began shouting and moving frantically. The police officers maintaining the perimeter started looking around frantically, trying to determine where the shot had come from. Parents behind the police barriers began screaming, fearing that the shooting indicated harm to their children. Sarah was already preparing for her next shot when she spotted the second gunman through a different window. This target was more challenging, partially concealed behind what appeared to be a doorframe, moving erratically, and holding what looked like a hostage in front of him. Sarah could see enough of the gunman to attempt a shot, but the risk of hitting the hostage was significant. David had moved to a position where he could see the school's main entrance. He watched as the third gunman appeared in the doorway, apparently trying to determine what had happened to his partner. The man was holding a pistol and scanning the area around the school, looking for threats. David realized that if this man retreated back into the building, the remaining hostages would be in even greater danger. Using a technique he had learned in Afghanistan, David fired a smoke grenade toward the school's main entrance. The grenade landed near the building and began producing a thick cloud of white smoke that obscured the gunman's vision while creating cover for any hostages who might try to escape. The effect was exactly what David had hoped for. Confused by the smoke and unnerved by the death of his partner, the gunman at the main entrance stepped further outside the building, apparently trying to see through the smoke cloud. This gave Sarah the clear shot she had been waiting for. Sarah's second shot was even more precise than her first. The gunman dropped instantly, his weapon skittering across the pavement. But Sarah's celebration was brief, because she could see through her scope that there was movement inside the smoke cloud. Someone was emerging from the building, but she couldn't tell if it was another gunman or an escaping hostage. The figure that emerged from the smoke turned out to be a young teacher carrying two small children. The woman was clearly terrified but was running toward the police perimeter as fast as she could while carrying the children. Behind her, more figures began emerging from the building, children and adults fleeing the chaos inside the school. Sarah kept her scope trained on the building, searching for the remaining gunman she had seen earlier. She spotted him moving near what appeared to be the gymnasium entrance, but he was no longer holding a hostage. Instead, he seemed to be trying to barricade himself inside a classroom, apparently planning to make a final stand. David made the decision to move closer to the building. Using the smoke from his grenade as cover, he approached the school from the east side, staying low and moving quickly from cover to cover. His goal was to get close enough to provide accurate information about the remaining gunman's location and to assist in the evacuation of any remaining hostages. As David reached the building, he could hear voices from inside, children crying, adults trying to calm them, and the remaining gunman shouting demands that no one seemed to understand. David used his radio to contact the police command post, providing them with real-time intelligence about the situation inside the building. The police response was swift and professional once they had accurate information. A tactical team that had just arrived from a neighboring county was able to enter the building and neutralize the final gunman without further casualties. The entire crisis was over less than 20 minutes after Sarah had fired her first shot. The aftermath of the Pine Ridge School incident was complex and far-reaching. Sarah and David were initially detained by law enforcement, partly for their own protection and partly while investigators tried to understand exactly what had happened. The FBI conducted extensive interviews with both of them, trying to determine whether their actions had helped or hindered the official response. The investigation ultimately concluded that Sarah and David's intervention had saved lives. The gunman had been preparing to execute hostages when Sarah's first shot disrupted their plans. The smoke grenade had enabled the escape of more than 30 children and staff members who might otherwise have remained trapped. The final casualty count was 2 gunmen dead and 1 wounded, with no fatalities among the hostages. But the legal implications were significant. Sarah and David had technically violated multiple laws by engaging in what prosecutors could argue was vigilante justice. They had used military-grade weapons in a civilian area, potentially endangered bystanders, and interfered with an official police operation. If the authorities chose to prosecute, both of them could face serious criminal charges. The decision about prosecution became a political and media sensation. Public opinion was overwhelmingly supportive of Sarah and David's actions. Parents of the rescued children organized rallies and fundraisers on their behalf. Veterans groups rallied to support David, arguing that he had used his military training to protect innocent civilians when the authorities were unable to respond effectively. The media attention focused particularly on Sarah. A 17-year-old girl who could make precision shots at 350 yards under combat conditions was unprecedented in civilian law enforcement. News outlets ran extensive features about her unusual background and training, often portraying her as a symbol of American self-reliance and preparedness. But the attention also brought scrutiny of David's training methods. Child psychologists and education experts questioned whether it was appropriate or healthy to train a child for combat situations. Some critics argued that Sarah's childhood had been stolen by her father's paranoid obsession with security and violence. Sarah herself handled the media attention with the same calm composure she had shown during the school incident. In interviews, she explained her actions matter-of-factly, emphasizing that she had simply done what was necessary to protect innocent people. She showed no signs of trauma or regret, but she also expressed no pleasure in the violence she had been forced to use. The legal resolution came after weeks of investigation and deliberation. The district attorney announced that no charges would be filed against Sarah or David, citing the extraordinary circumstances of the case and the positive outcome of their intervention. The decision was influenced by testimony from the rescued hostages, who uniformly credited Sarah and David with saving their lives. Colonel Rodriguez, who had been following the case closely, saw the Pine Ridge incident as confirmation of what he had observed during his visit to the Chen cabin. Sarah wasn't just an exceptionally skilled marksman, she was someone who could function effectively under the most extreme pressure while making sound moral judgments about the use of force.
The colonel's offer of military training took on new urgency after Pine Ridge.
Sarah had demonstrated that her skills were beyond what even elite military units typically achieved, but she had also shown that she needed additional training to operate effectively in complex tactical environments. Her intervention at the school had been successful largely because the situation was relatively straightforward, clearly identifiable bad guys threatening innocent people.
Future situations might be far more ambiguous.
Sarah accepted Colonel Rodriguez's offer, but with conditions. She wanted assurance that her training would focus on protecting innocent people rather than simply learning to kill more efficiently. She wanted to understand the legal and ethical frameworks that governed the use of force by military personnel.
And she wanted to maintain her connection to her father and their mountain home, the foundation of everything she had become.
The arrangement that emerged was unprecedented in military training. Sarah would spend 6 months of each year at Colonel Rodriguez's facility, receiving intensive training in advanced marksmanship, tactical operations, and military law. She would spend the other 6 months at home, helping David with his guide business and continuing to develop her wilderness skills. But, before Sarah could begin her formal military training, she had one more challenge to face.
The Pine Ridge incident had attracted attention from criminal organizations who saw Sarah as a potential threat to their operations.
Word spread through certain circles about the teenage girl who had taken out armed criminals with surgical precision.
Some saw this as a threat that needed to be eliminated. The first attempt on Sarah's life came just 2 weeks after the school incident.
Sarah was alone at the cabin, conducting routine maintenance on her equipment, when the motion sensors detected movement in the forest.
But, this time, the intruders were professionals.
They moved with military precision, used sophisticated equipment to avoid detection, and clearly knew about Sarah's capabilities and defensive preparations. Sarah found herself facing the ultimate test of all her training. The men approaching her cabin weren't desperate criminals or random thugs. They were skilled operatives who had been sent specifically to kill her, and they knew exactly what they were up against. For the first time in her life, Sarah was facing opponents who might be as skilled and well-trained as she was. The battle for the Chen cabin would prove to be the defining moment in Sarah's development, the crucible that would transform her from a remarkably skilled teenager into something approaching a force of nature. It would also attract the attention of government agencies far beyond local law enforcement, agencies that would ultimately reshape Sarah's entire future. Sarah knew something was different the moment her motion sensors activated.
The patterns were too coordinated, too professional.
These weren't opportunistic criminals stumbling through the forest. These were predators who had been studying their prey. As she watched the thermal imaging displays in the cabin's security room, Sarah counted at least 6 figures moving through the trees with military precision, approaching from multiple directions simultaneously. David was 3 days into his expedition with the corporate clients, too far away to help even if Sarah could reach him by radio. The nearest law enforcement was hours away, and Sarah had learned from Pine Ridge that sometimes waiting for help meant watching innocent people die. But, this time, she was the innocent person who needed protection, and there was no one else to provide it. Sarah activated the cabin's defensive systems that David had installed over the years. Motion-activated floodlights illuminated sections of the forest around their home, but the intruders were already wearing night vision equipment and didn't seem bothered by the lights. Automated recordings began broadcasting warnings about trespassing and armed response, but the figures continued their steady approach. From her position in the second-floor shooting room, Sarah could see that the attackers were carrying military-grade weapons and wearing tactical gear. They moved with the coordinated precision of a special operations team, using hand signals and maintaining perfect spacing as they closed in on the cabin. Whoever had sent these men had invested serious resources in eliminating Sarah Chen. The first shot came from the tree lean to the north, a high-powered rifle round that shattered the window next to Sarah's position. She rolled away from the broken glass as more shots began impacting the cabin from multiple directions. The attackers were using suppressed weapons, making their muzzle flashes difficult to spot, but Sarah had been trained to locate threats by sound and movement as well as visual cues.
Sarah's return fire was immediate and precise.
Using her knowledge of the forest around the cabin, she aimed for positions where attackers would likely take cover. Her first shot punched through a tree trunk that she knew was thick enough to conceal a person but too thin to stop a rifle bullet. She heard a scream from the forest, confirming that her tactical knowledge was better than her opponents had expected. But the attackers adapted quickly. They began using smoke grenades to obscure their movements, just as David had done at Pine Ridge. Sarah found herself fighting an opponent who could learn from her own family's tactics and turn them against her. The situation was becoming more dangerous by the minute. Sarah activated the emergency beacon that would alert both David and law enforcement to the attack, but she knew she couldn't wait for rescue. The attackers were pressing their advantage, moving closer to the cabin under cover of the artificial fog they had created. If they reached the building, Sarah would lose the advantage of range and concealment that had kept her alive so far. Using techniques David had drilled into her for years, Sarah began moving through the cabin's defensive positions. David had prepared multiple shooting locations throughout the building, each offering different fields of fire and escape routes. Sarah moved from position to position, engaging targets and relocating before return fire could find her. The attackers' strategy became clear as the battle continued. They were trying to force Sarah into a defensive position where they could overwhelm her with superior numbers. Two teams were working to get close enough to the cabin to use explosives, while a third team provided covering fire from longer range. It was a sophisticated plan that would have worked against most defenders. But Sarah wasn't most defenders. She had grown up in these mountains, knew every tree and rock within a mile of the cabin, and had spent years preparing for exactly this type of attack. Instead of staying inside the cabin as her attackers expected, Sarah decided to take the fight to them. Using a concealed exit that David had built for emergencies, Sarah slipped out of the cabin and into the forest. She carried her rifle, a backup pistol, extra ammunition, and a knife that David had taught her to use with lethal efficiency. Sarah also carried something her attackers didn't expect: the absolute knowledge that she was fighting for her life on ground she knew better than anyone else in the world. Moving through the forest with the silent precision her father had taught her, Sarah began hunting the people who had come to hunt her. She used her intimate knowledge of the terrain to approach the attackers' positions from directions they couldn't see or anticipate. The hunters were about to become the hunted. Sarah's first target was the sniper who had taken position on the rocky outcrop north of the cabin. The man was well concealed and had an excellent field of fire, but he had chosen a position that Sarah had used for hunting practice since she was 12 years old. She knew exactly how to approach it without being detected. Moving like a shadow through terrain she knew by heart, Sarah worked her way to within 50 yards of the sniper's position. The man was focused on the cabin, expecting Sarah to still be inside the building. He never saw the teenage girl who rose from the forest behind him like an avenging angel. Sarah's shot at close range was instantly fatal. The sniper collapsed without making a sound, his expensive rifle falling silent. But Sarah knew that eliminating one threat would make the others more cautious and dangerous. She had bought herself some time and reduced the odds against her, but the battle was far from over. The attackers' communications revealed their growing frustration. They had expected to overwhelm a teenage girl with superior numbers and equipment, but instead they were being systematically hunted by someone who fought like a ghost in the forest. Their careful plan was falling apart, and they were beginning to make mistakes born of desperation. Sarah exploited those mistakes with ruthless efficiency. When two of the attackers moved to investigate their missing sniper, Sarah was waiting for them in a position that offered no escape routes. Her rifle spoke twice in rapid succession, and two more threats were eliminated. The odds were beginning to shift in Sarah's favor. But the remaining attackers weren't giving up. They regrouped and changed tactics, abandoning their careful approach for a direct assault on the cabin. They apparently believed Sarah was still inside the building and decided to end the standoff with overwhelming firepower. What they got instead was a painful lesson in tactical deception. While the surviving attackers concentrated their fire on the cabin, Sarah moved to a position that gave her clear shots at all of them. They were focused on a building that no longer contained their target, leaving themselves exposed to someone who could hit moving targets at ranges they hadn't thought possible. Sarah's final shots of the night were works of art. Each round found its target with surgical precision, dropping men who had believed themselves to be the most dangerous people in the mountains. When the shooting stopped, 6 professional killers lay dead in the forest around the Chen cabin, eliminated by a 17-year-old girl who had refused to be anyone's victim. The aftermath of the night battle brought attention Sarah had never wanted and would never fully escape. The FBI's investigation revealed that the attackers had been sent by a criminal organization with international connections, people who had seen Sarah's intervention at Pine Ridge as a threat to their operations in the western United States. But the investigation also revealed something more disturbing.
The attack on Sarah hadn't been a one-time retaliation.
It was part of a larger pattern of criminal organizations targeting law enforcement personnel, military veterans, and civilians who had interfered with their activities. Sarah's name was on a list that included federal agents, special operations soldiers, and other people marked for elimination. Colonel Rodriguez arrived at the cabin within hours of the battle's end, bringing with him a team of military investigators and security specialists. What he found impressed him even more than Sarah's performance at Pine Ridge. 6 trained killers had attacked a teenage girl on ground of her choosing, and none of them had survived. It was a level of combat effectiveness that exceeded most special operations units. But Rodriguez was also concerned about the implications. Sarah had demonstrated that she was extraordinarily dangerous when threatened, but she was also now marked for death by people with unlimited resources and international reach. Keeping her safe would require more than just staying hidden in the mountains. It would require the kind of protection and training that only the military could provide. The offer Rodriguez made this time was different from his earlier proposal. Sarah wouldn't just be invited to train with elite military units. She would be given full protection under programs normally reserved for the most valuable intelligence assets and special operations personnel. In exchange, Sarah would commit to using her skills in service of protecting innocent people, wherever and whenever such protection was needed. Sarah's decision was influenced by a conversation with one of the FBI agents investigating the attack. The agent explained that the criminal organization responsible for sending the killers was involved in human trafficking, drug smuggling, and other activities that caused suffering for thousands of innocent people. Sarah's intervention at Pine Ridge had disrupted one of their money laundering operations, which was why they had marked her for death. "You have a choice," the agent told Sarah. "You can hide and hope they eventually forget about you, or you can join the people who are fighting them. But understand that if you choose to hide, other people will die because you weren't there to protect them." Sarah understood that her childhood was over. The skills David had given her to protect herself and her family had made her a target, but they had also made her responsible for using those skills to protect others. There was no going back to the quiet life she had once known. David struggled with Sarah's decision to accept Rodriguez's offer. He had trained his daughter to protect herself, not to become a professional warrior. But he also understood that the attack on the cabin had changed everything. Sarah would never be safe as long as she remained a civilian target. Her only real protection was to become so valuable to the government that they would ensure her safety. The legal arrangements for Sarah's new status took weeks to negotiate. She would officially become a government contractor, working for agencies that most people had never heard of. Her age required special congressional approval and presidential authorization. Sarah Chen was becoming the youngest person in American history to receive the kind of clearances and authorities normally reserved for senior intelligence operatives. But before Sarah could begin her new role, she had to complete the most intensive training program the military had ever designed. Colonel Rodriguez assembled instructors from every elite unit in the American military: SEALs, Rangers, Delta Force, Marine Force Reconnaissance, and specialized units so classified that their names couldn't be spoken outside secure facilities. Sarah's training began at a remote facility in Nevada where the military tested its most advanced weapons and tactics. For 6 months, she was pushed beyond limits she hadn't known existed. Physical conditioning that would have broken most professional athletes. Marksmanship training that turned her natural talent into superhuman precision. Tactical instruction that taught her to think like a military strategist rather than just a skilled shooter. But the most important part of Sarah's training wasn't about weapons or tactics. It was about judgment. Sarah learned the legal frameworks that governed the use of force by American military personnel. She studied the ethics of warfare and the moral responsibilities that came with the power to take human lives. She learned to distinguish between legitimate targets and innocent civilians, between necessary force and excessive violence. Sarah excelled at every aspect of her training, but her instructors were most impressed by her emotional stability. Many students in elite military programs struggled with the psychological pressure of preparing for life-or-death combat. Sarah approached the training with the same calm focus she had always shown, understanding that these skills were tools to be used responsibly rather than weapons to be enjoyed. When Sarah's formal training was complete, she was assigned to a unit that didn't officially exist. Her teammates were volunteers from various special operations units who had been selected for their skills, judgment, and ability to work independently.
Their mission was to handle threats that conventional law enforcement and military units couldn't address effectively. Sarah's first official operation came just days after her 18th birthday.
Intelligence agencies had identified a terrorist cell planning an attack on a school in California, similar to what had happened at Pine Ridge but with international implications. The terrorists were using children as human shields, making a conventional assault impossible. The operation required precisely the skills Sarah had developed, the ability to eliminate threats at long range while avoiding harm to innocent people. Working with her new team, Sarah positioned herself nearly half a mile from the terrorist stronghold and waited for the perfect moment to act. When the moment came, Sarah's shots were perfect. 3 terrorists were eliminated in rapid succession, each shot placed with surgical precision to avoid any risk to the hostages.
The remaining terrorists surrendered when they realized they were facing an opponent they couldn't see, couldn't locate, and couldn't escape. After the operation, Sarah's team leader asked her the question that had become routine in her post-mission debriefings: "How do you feel about what happened today?" Sarah's answer was the same as always: "I did what was necessary to protect innocent people. That's what I was trained to do." But, privately, Sarah knew that her life had become something she had never expected or wanted. She was no longer Sarah Chen, the mountain girl who had learned to shoot to protect her family. She was now a government asset, a human weapon deployed against threats that most people would never know existed. It was a heavy responsibility for someone who was still technically a teenager. The weight of that responsibility became clear during Sarah's first meeting with Colonel Rodriguez after the California operation. Rodriguez explained that Sarah's unique combination of skills, judgment, and youth made her invaluable for operations that required someone who could blend into civilian environments while possessing military-level capabilities. "You're not a soldier in the traditional sense," Rodriguez told her. "You're something new, something we've never had before. The question is whether you're prepared for what that means." Sarah's answer would shape not only her own future, but the future of how America protected its citizens from threats that conventional forces couldn't handle. She was about to become the most lethal protector in the country's arsenal, a guardian angel who could eliminate threats with precision that bordered on the supernatural. But, first, Sarah had to prove that she could maintain her humanity while wielding such deadly power. That test would come sooner than anyone expected, in a situation that would challenge everything she believed about right and wrong, about the nature of justice, and about the price of protecting the innocent in an increasingly dangerous world. Sarah's test of moral resolve came in the form of Operation Silent Guardian, a mission that would define her role in America's shadow war against international criminals. The target was Viktor Kozlov, a Russian arms dealer who had been supplying weapons to terrorist organizations across 3 continents. Intelligence indicated that Kozlov was planning to sell stolen military explosives to a group planning attacks on American schools, hospitals, and shopping centers. The complexity of the mission went far beyond anything Sarah had previously encountered. Kozlov wasn't hiding in a remote compound or operating from a known criminal stronghold. He was conducting his business from a luxury hotel in downtown San Francisco, surrounded by hundreds of innocent civilians and protected by a security detail of former special operations soldiers from various countries. Sarah's briefing took place in a secure facility beneath the federal building in San Francisco. Colonel Rodriguez was present, along with representatives from the FBI, CIA, and agencies so classified that they identified themselves only by first names. The assembled group represented the highest levels of American intelligence and special operations capabilities. "Kozlov has diplomatic immunity," explained Agent Sarah. She had specifically requested to work with someone who shared her name, finding it easier to maintain her cover identity. "He's traveling on a diplomatic passport from a country that gives him legal protection from arrest or detention. Conventional law enforcement can't touch him, and military action would create an international incident." The photographs and intelligence files painted a picture of a man who had caused immense suffering while remaining beyond the reach of traditional justice. Kozlov's weapons had been used in attacks that killed thousands of innocent people, including many children. The explosives he planned to sell would enable attacks that could dwarf even the worst terrorist incidents in American history. "The window of opportunity is extremely narrow," Rodriguez explained. "Kozlov will be in San Francisco for exactly 72 hours. He's meeting with buyers who have already paid for the explosives. If this transaction is completed, we estimate it could result in casualties numbering in the tens of thousands." Sarah studied the surveillance photographs of the hotel and surrounding area. The building was a 40-story luxury tower in the heart of the city's financial district, surrounded by other high-rises filled with innocent people.
The streets below were crowded with pedestrians and vehicles. Any mistake could result in massive collateral damage.
What about evacuation? Sarah asked, already knowing the answer would be complicated.
Impossible, replied the CIA representative. Any large-scale evacuation would alert Kozlov and his security team. They would either abort the meeting or move to a more secure location. This might be our only chance to stop this sale. Sarah realized that she was being asked to consider the most difficult shot of her career, eliminating a target in a densely populated urban environment with no margin for error.
The technical challenges were enormous, but the moral implications were even more complex.
She would be acting as judge, jury, and executioner for a man who had never been convicted of any crime in an American court.
What's the legal authority for this operation?
Sarah asked, demonstrating the thorough understanding of military law that had been part of her training. Rodriguez handed her a folder containing documents with more classification markings than Sarah had ever seen. The authorization came from the highest levels of government and had been approved through channels that most people didn't know existed. Sarah was being given authority that was normally reserved for active combat zones, authority to eliminate threats to American security regardless of where those threats were located.
Sarah spent the next 24 hours studying every aspect of the target and the environment.
Kozlov was staying in a penthouse suite on the 40th floor of the hotel, a suite that offered panoramic views of the city but also made him visible from numerous locations. His security detail was professional and thorough, but they were focused on threats at ground level and close range, not on a sniper operating from extreme distance. The shooting position Sarah selected was unprecedented in urban sniper operations. She would fire from the roof of a building nearly 3/4 of a mile from the hotel, a distance that pushed the limits of even her extraordinary abilities. The shot would have to account for wind patterns created by the surrounding skyscrapers, the heat shimmer rising from the concrete streets, and the movement of the target. But the technical challenges were nothing compared to the personal ones. Sarah had killed before, but always in situations where she was protecting herself or others from immediate harm. This was different. She would be eliminating a man who posed no direct threat to her, based on intelligence about crimes he might commit in the future. Sarah's preparation involved not just studying ballistics tables and weather patterns, but also examining her own conscience. She read the intelligence files about Kozlov's previous activities, studying photographs of the victims of attacks that had used his weapons. She looked at pictures of children who had died in bombings, families destroyed by terrorist attacks, and communities devastated by violence that Kozlov had enabled. The night before the operation, Sarah called her father for the first time since beginning her new assignment. David was still in the mountains, still guiding clients through the wilderness that had shaped both their lives. Talking to him helped Sarah remember who she was and why she had chosen this path. "I'm facing a decision," Sarah told her father, unable to provide details about the mission but needing his guidance about the moral questions involved.
"Are innocent people in danger?" David asked. "Yes, many of them. Can anyone else stop that danger?" "No." "Do you believe you're being asked to do the right thing?" Sarah considered the question carefully.
"I believe I'm being asked to prevent something terrible from happening to people who don't deserve to suffer."
"Then, you already know what you need to do," David said simply. "Trust your judgment. Trust your training.
And remember that sometimes good people have to do hard things to protect those who can't protect themselves." On the morning of the operation, Sarah took her position on the rooftop of a building that housed law offices and financial consultancies. Her equipment included the most advanced sniper rifle the military had ever developed, specially modified for extreme-range urban operations. The rifle was equipped with a computerized scope that could calculate wind, humidity, temperature, and target movement in real time. Sarah's support team included spotters, communications specialists, and security personnel who ensured she wouldn't be disturbed during the critical moments of the operation. But, ultimately, the success or failure of the mission would depend on Sarah's ability to make an impossible shot under impossible conditions. Kozlov appeared in the penthouse suite's main room at exactly 10:30 a.m., just as intelligence had predicted. Through her scope, Sarah could see him clearly despite the extreme distance. He was a tall, thin man with gray hair and expensive clothing, talking on a cell phone while gesturing toward papers spread across a conference table. Sarah settled into her shooting position and began the careful process of preparing for the shot. She monitored wind conditions using instruments positioned at various points between her location and the target. She calculated the trajectory needed to send a bullet across nearly 3/4 of a mile of urban landscape. She controlled her breathing and heart rate, achieving the physiological state that would give her the best chance of accuracy. At 10:47 a.m., Kozlov moved to a position near the penthouse's main window, talking to someone Sarah couldn't see. Intelligence had indicated that this would be when he conducted the critical part of his business, the moment when he would finalize the sale of explosives that could kill thousands of innocent Americans. Sarah placed her crosshairs on Kozlov's center mass and began the final sequence her father had taught her years earlier in the mountains of Northern California. She controlled her breathing, steadied her position, and applied gradual pressure to the trigger. The shot would travel for nearly 2 seconds before reaching its target, during which time Kozlov could move, wind conditions could change, or any of a dozen other factors could affect the bullet's path. The rifle's recoil was absorbed by the bipod and shooting rest Sarah had positioned according to specifications developed by military researchers. Through her scope, Sarah watched the bullet's impact with clinical detachment. Kozlov fell immediately, dropping out of sight behind the window frame. The shot had been perfect, traveling 1,247 yards to strike its target with surgical precision. Sarah's spotter confirmed the hit through his own optical equipment. Intelligence personnel monitoring communications from the hotel reported chaos and confusion as Kozlov's security detail tried to understand what had happened. The arms dealer was dead, the explosive sale was prevented, and the planned terrorist attacks would not occur. But, as Sarah packed her equipment and prepared to leave the rooftop, she felt something she had never experienced after previous shooting incidents. Instead of the calm satisfaction of a job well done, she felt a profound sadness about the necessity of what she had been forced to do. During her post-mission debriefing, Sarah was praised for accomplishing what military experts had considered nearly impossible. The shot would become a case study in precision marksmanship, and Sarah's performance would establish new standards for urban sniper operations. From a technical standpoint, the mission had been a complete success. But, when asked about her emotional state following the operation, Sarah gave an answer that surprised her handlers. "I feel sad that we live in a world where someone like me has to exist," she said. "I'm grateful that I was able to prevent innocent people from dying, but I'm also sorry that Viktor Kozlov chose a path that made killing him necessary." Colonel Rodriguez recognized that Sarah's response indicated exactly the kind of moral compass that made her valuable for operations like Silent Guardian. Someone who took pleasure in killing, even justified killing, would eventually become a liability. Someone who understood the moral weight of taking human life, even necessary killing, could be trusted with the extraordinary power Sarah wielded. The success of Operation Silent Guardian led to additional assignments that tested different aspects of Sarah's capabilities. She eliminated a terrorist leader who was planning an attack on a children's hospital, working from a concealed position that required her to remain motionless for 14 hours while waiting for the perfect shot. She stopped a human trafficking operation by eliminating the organization's leadership during a meeting in a remote warehouse, demonstrating that her skills extended beyond extreme-range shooting to close-quarters combat. Each operation added to Sarah's reputation within the intelligence community as someone who could accomplish missions that others considered impossible. But each operation also added to the emotional burden she carried as someone who had taken more human lives than most combat veterans, despite being barely 19 years old. The psychological evaluations that were part of Sarah's routine assessments showed someone who was remarkably stable given the nature of her work, but who was also beginning to show signs of the isolation that affected many people in similar roles. Sarah was becoming one of the most effective operatives in American service, but she was also becoming someone who existed apart from normal human society. Sarah's handlers began to worry about her long-term sustainability. The combination of extreme stress, moral complexity, and social isolation that defined her work had destroyed many operatives who hadn't faced challenges as severe as hers. Plans were developed to provide Sarah with additional psychological support and to ensure that she maintained connections to life outside her operational duties. The solution came in the form of a new assignment that would require Sarah to work as part of a team rather than as a solo operative. Intelligence agencies had identified a criminal organization that was operating across multiple countries, conducting activities that ranged from arms dealing to human trafficking to terrorist financing. Stopping this organization would require coordinated operations involving multiple specialists working together. Sarah would be paired with other elite operatives, each with their own specialized skills and backgrounds. The team would include a former Navy SEAL who specialized in close-quarters combat, a CIA operative who was expert in surveillance and intelligence gathering, and a military intelligence specialist who could coordinate complex operations across international boundaries. Working as part of a team would provide Sarah with something she had been missing: colleagues who understood the moral complexities of their work and who could provide mutual support during difficult operations. For the first time since leaving her father's cabin, Sarah would be part of a community of people who shared her commitment to protecting innocent lives. The team's first operation would be their most challenging, infiltrating a criminal organization that had been responsible for some of the worst atrocities in recent memory. The mission would require Sarah to go undercover in a role that was completely different from her previous work. Instead of operating from concealed positions as a sniper, she would have to pose as a civilian and gather intelligence while remaining undetected. Sarah's training for undercover work revealed capabilities that even her handlers hadn't suspected. Her natural intelligence and emotional control made her excellent at assuming false identities and maintaining cover stories under pressure. Her combat skills remained available if needed, but they were hidden beneath the persona of someone who appeared to be a completely ordinary young woman. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that her greatest strength as an undercover operative was her ability to appear harmless and innocent. The same appearance that had once made people underestimate her abilities now served to conceal those abilities from criminals who would kill her instantly if they suspected her true nature. As Sarah prepared for her first undercover mission, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a mountain cabin to the highest levels of intelligence operations. She had become someone who could protect innocent people from threats they would never know existed, but she had also become someone who could never return to the simple life she had once known. The choice between protecting others and preserving her own innocence had been made years ago in a mountain cabin where a young girl had learned that sometimes good people had to do terrible things to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Sarah had made that choice without fully understanding its implications, but she had never regretted it. Now, as she prepared to enter the most dangerous phase of her career, Sarah understood that her greatest challenge wouldn't be the technical demands of her missions or the physical dangers she would face. Her greatest challenge would be maintaining her humanity while wielding power that few people could imagine and bearing responsibilities that would have crushed most adults. The final test of Sarah's character was about to begin, a test that would determine not just whether she could succeed as an undercover operative, but whether she could emerge from the darkness of her work as someone who was still recognizably the person her father had raised to protect innocent life. Sarah's undercover assignment began in Prague, a city where centuries of history created perfect cover for modern criminals. Her target was the Kozlov Syndicate, the organization that had survived Viktor Kozlov's death by adapting and expanding their operations. Intelligence indicated they were planning something called Operation Schoolyard, an attack that would make previous terrorist incidents seem minor by comparison. Sarah's cover identity was Elena Vasquez, a graduate student in international relations who was researching human trafficking patterns in Eastern Europe. The identity gave her reason to ask questions, travel freely, and interact with people connected to criminal organizations without arousing suspicion. What made the cover particularly effective was that it was close enough to Sarah's real personality that she could maintain it indefinitely without the psychological strain that destroyed many undercover operatives. The safe house Sarah operated from was a modest apartment near Charles University, chosen because it provided excellent sight lines to several buildings used by the Kozlov Syndicate while appearing completely unremarkable to neighbors and surveillance. Sarah's equipment was hidden in places that would pass even expert searches, disguised as everything from textbooks to computer peripherals. Sarah's team members operated from their own cover identities throughout the city. Marcus Stone, the former Navy SEAL, posed as an American businessman exploring investment opportunities in Czech manufacturing. Jennifer Walsh, the CIA operative, worked as a freelance journalist covering Eastern European politics. Thomas Kim, the military intelligence specialist, operated from the American embassy under diplomatic cover. The challenge of infiltrating the Kozlov Syndicate was complicated by their sophisticated security measures and their well-founded paranoia about government infiltration. They had survived law enforcement attention from multiple countries by maintaining strict operational security and eliminating anyone they suspected of working for authorities. Several previous attempts at infiltration had ended with the discovery of mutilated bodies bearing signs of extensive torture. Sarah's approach was different from previous operations because she didn't try to penetrate the organization directly. Instead, she focused on the people around the syndicate, the legitimate business owners who laundered money for them, the corrupt officials who provided protection, and the family members who enjoyed the benefits of criminal wealth while remaining technically innocent of criminal activity. The breakthrough came through Dmitry Kozlov, Viktor's younger brother who had inherited leadership of the organization. Unlike his late brother, Dmitry had a weakness for attractive young women and frequently attended social events where he tried to impress potential romantic partners with displays of wealth and power. Sarah positioned herself to meet Dmitry at a charity gala for refugee assistance, an event that provided perfect irony for someone planning to create more refugees through terrorist attacks. Sarah's interaction with Dmitry required her to suppress every instinct her father had taught her about dealing with dangerous predators. Instead of maintaining distance and preparing for combat, she had to appear interested in Dmitry's attention while gathering intelligence about his organization's activities. The role required acting skills that Sarah had never developed and emotional control beyond anything her previous training had demanded. Dmitry proved to be exactly the combination of dangerous and stupid that made him valuable as an intelligence source. He was smart enough to run a criminal organization, but arrogant enough to believe that his wealth and power made him irresistible to women. When Sarah showed interest in his stories about international business and exotic travel, Dmitry began sharing details about operations that should have remained completely secret. Over the course of several weeks, Sarah learned that Operation Schoolyard was far worse than intelligence agencies had suspected. The Kozlov syndicate wasn't planning a single terrorist attack, they were coordinating simultaneous attacks on schools across 5 countries, timed to occur during graduation ceremonies when families would be gathered to celebrate their children's achievements. The psychological impact would be devastating, and the casualty count would be enormous. The planning for these attacks involved resources and coordination that exceeded anything terrorists had previously attempted. The syndicate had recruited operatives from multiple extremist organizations, provided them with sophisticated weapons and explosives, and arranged for coordinated media coverage that would amplify the terror and chaos following the attacks. It was terrorism elevated to the level of international warfare. Sarah's discovery of the true scope of Operation Schoolyard created an urgent operational problem. The attacks were scheduled to occur in less than 2 weeks, which meant there wasn't time to develop conventional responses. Law enforcement agencies in 5 countries would need to coordinate arrests and raids simultaneously, but intelligence about specific targets and operatives was still incomplete. The solution Sarah proposed was as dangerous as it was unprecedented. Instead of trying to gather more intelligence about the planned attacks, she would position herself to eliminate the operation's leadership during a meeting that was scheduled to occur in Prague. Dmitry had mentioned that all the key figures involved in Operation Schoolyard would gather to finalize their plans, making it possible to decapitate the entire conspiracy with a single action. Colonel Rodriguez and the other senior officials overseeing Sarah's mission were reluctant to authorize such a high-risk operation. Sarah would be operating alone, surrounded by some of the most dangerous criminals in the world, with no immediate backup available. If anything went wrong, she would face capture, torture, and death at the hands of people who had perfected methods for extracting information from prisoners. But the alternative was allowing attacks that could kill thousands of innocent children and their families. The intelligence Sarah had gathered indicated that stopping Operation Schoolyard through conventional law enforcement would be impossible given the time constraints and international coordination required. Sarah's proposal offered the only realistic chance of preventing the attacks. Sarah's final preparation for the mission included elements that were both practical and emotional. She updated her will, recorded messages for her father that would be delivered if she didn't survive, and completed psychological evaluations designed to ensure she was mentally prepared for what might be required of her. She also spent hours studying the layout of the meeting location and planning contingencies for various scenarios. The meeting was scheduled to take place in a private dining room at one of Prague's most exclusive restaurants, a location that provided excellent security for the criminals while making any kind of rescue operation extremely difficult. Sarah would attend as Dmitry's guest, positioning herself to eliminate as many targets as possible before the survivors could organize a response. Sarah's equipment for the mission was concealed in ways that would have impressed magicians. Her primary weapon was a ceramic knife that could pass through metal detectors, hidden in the spine of an academic journal she carried as part of her cover identity. Backup weapons were disguised as jewelry, electronics, and personal items that would appear completely innocent to anyone searching her. The evening of the meeting, Sarah dressed in an elegant black dress that concealed body armor designed to stop pistol rounds while remaining undetectable to casual observation. She carried herself with the confidence of someone attending a social event, but every sense was alert for threats and opportunities. This would be the most dangerous mission of her career, and possibly the last. Dmitry picked Sarah up at her apartment in an armored limousine, behaving like a man showing off for a woman he hoped to impress. During the drive to the restaurant, he provided Sarah with a running commentary about the other guests who would be attending, unknowingly giving her final intelligence about targets she might need to eliminate. The restaurant was exactly as sophisticated and secure as Sarah had expected. Armed guards checked guests for weapons using both metal detectors and physical searches, but Sarah's ceramic knife and other equipment passed inspection without difficulty. The private dining room was on the third floor, accessible only by a single staircase that would become a bottleneck if Sarah needed to escape quickly. The other guests at the dinner represented a gathering of some of the most dangerous people in the world. Sarah recognized several faces from intelligence files, arms dealers, terrorist leaders, and criminal masterminds who had caused suffering across multiple continents. They spoke casually about operations that had killed thousands of innocent people, treating mass murder as a business opportunity. Sarah's training in emotional control was tested beyond its limits as she listened to detailed discussions about the planned school attacks. The criminals spoke about children as targets rather than human beings, calculating casualty figures with the same detachment they might use to discuss shipping costs. Sarah had to suppress every instinct that told her to immediately eliminate these monsters before they could harm more innocent people. The moment Sarah had been waiting for came during the main course, when Dmitri stood to propose a toast celebrating the success of Operation Schoolyard. As glasses were raised around the table, Sarah struck with speed and precision that left no time for defensive reactions. Her ceramic knife found Dmitri's throat before he could finish his toast. Sarah's second target was the terrorist leader sitting to her left, eliminated with a movement so quick that other diners didn't immediately understand what was happening. By the time the remaining criminals began reaching for their weapons, Sarah had already killed 3 of the most important figures in the conspiracy. The dining room erupted in chaos as armed men tried to distinguish targets from innocent bystanders while Sarah moved among them like death itself. Her years of training in close-quarters combat served her well in the confined space, where her smaller size and superior speed gave her advantages that outweighed the criminals' superior numbers. Sarah's escape from the restaurant required every skill her father had taught her about moving through hostile territory. She fought her way down the staircase, eliminated the guards in the lobby, and disappeared into Prague's maze of ancient streets before police could respond to reports of gunfire. By the time authorities arrived at the restaurant, they found 7 dead criminals and no trace of who had killed them. The elimination of Operation Schoolyard's leadership had exactly the effect Sarah had intended. Without coordination from the Prague meeting, the planned attacks collapsed into chaos. Some operatives were arrested when they tried to proceed without proper support. Others fled when they realized their conspiracy had been compromised. The attacks that would have killed thousands of innocent children never occurred. Sarah's extraction from Prague was handled by her team members, who had been positioned throughout the city to assist her escape. Within hours of the restaurant operation, Sarah was aboard a military transport aircraft heading back to the United States. The mission had been successful beyond anyone's expectations, but the personal cost to Sarah was still being calculated. During her post-mission debriefings, Sarah demonstrated the same calm professionalism she had always shown, but her handlers noticed subtle changes that indicated the psychological strain she had endured. She spoke more quietly, smiled less frequently, and seemed to be carrying a weight that hadn't been there before the Prague operation. The psychological evaluation that was standard after undercover missions revealed that Sarah was experiencing what specialists called moral injury, the psychological damage that occurred when someone was forced to act against their fundamental values in order to serve a greater good. Sarah's actions in Prague had been necessary and heroic, but they had also required her to become someone she had never wanted to become. Colonel Rodriguez recognized that Sarah needed time to process what she had experienced and to reconnect with the values that had originally motivated her to accept such dangerous assignments. He arranged for Sarah to return to her father's cabin in Northern California, where she could recover in the place that had shaped her character and reminded her of who she truly was. David Chen recognized the changes in his daughter immediately. Sarah had left for Prague as someone who was still recognizably the girl he had raised in the mountains. She returned as someone who carried the weight of experiences that few people could understand or share. She had succeeded in protecting innocent lives, but the cost of that success was written in her eyes. Father and daughter spent weeks hiking through the mountains where Sarah had learned her first lessons about protection and responsibility. They didn't talk much about Sarah's recent missions, but David helped her remember the principles that had guided all of her training: protect the innocent, use minimum necessary force, and never lose sight of the humanity in yourself and others. Slowly, Sarah began to recover the sense of purpose that had driven her since childhood. She understood that her work required her to do terrible things, but she also understood that the alternative was allowing innocent people to suffer at the hands of those who would know.